Today we have so much information at our digital fingertips, but it makes me wonder when I see something like the Australian Encyclopaedia about the value of human effort that has gone into some of these huge bodies of knowledge and information before the internet arrived. This is an advertisement for the second edition of the Australian Encyclopaedia of 1958, the subject of this talk today. Everything you want to know about Australia but were afraid to ask, now available in 10 volumes. Here are some of the staff of the Australian Encyclopaedia at the Angus and Robertson office in Castlereagh Street, Sydney. The term encyclopaedia comes from the Greek general education. It is meant to be an all-round education. The Great Mirror was a work completed in 1244, developed by a French medieval scholar, Vincent of Beauvais, who said that not only should his work be perused, but that the ideas it recorded should be taken to heart and imitated. The arrival of the printing press really saw the encyclopedia take off, particularly from the 18th century. So let us return to Australia and a brief history of Angus and Robertson, who were the publisher of the first and second editions of the Australian Encyclopaedia. So in 1884, Scotsman David Angus opened a bookshop in Market Street, Sydney, and he was later joined by fellow Scot George Robertson in a partnership. And then in 1895, Angus and Robertson moved to 89 Castlereagh Street, Sydney, and this remained their head office of the company up until the 1950s. The shop was described by Angus and Robertson as the biggest bookshop in the world. In 1925 to 1927, Angus and Robertson released a 2-volume set of the Australian Encyclopaedia. It had been delayed publication by the First World War and covered a lot of new material, but there was definitely scope for more. An article written by Bruce Pratt, who was the general editor of the 1958 edition, and also my grandfather. And Bruce we'll talk about later, but he wrote an article at the time of publication of the second edition talking about the beginnings. And he actually refers back to how Angus and Robertson, sort of as a way of gratitude to the country that had given them so much success, began the first edition of the encyclopedia. So in a way, the second edition, which was begun in 1948, had its logical beginnings much earlier on. Between 1927, the first edition, and 1948, a great deal had happened in both world and Australian history, and a very significant period in Australia's development and in terms of its challenges. There had been, of course, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the beginnings of World War II and Australia's involvement in that war, including the crisis of the war in the Pacific. There'd been huge technological progress at the same time, changed priorities immediately post-war, particularly in relation to an expansion in immigration. And there was the whole issue during the 1950s of atomic warfare and the Cold War. So once he was commissioned, Alec Chisholm began to tackle the project and in 1949 gradually assembled an editorial staff. And this extract from a recording from the Hazel de Burgh collection in the National Library, Alec Chisholm talks about how he got started.
This is Alec Chisholm speaking from Sydney, basically in regard to the Australian Encyclopaedia. The first question most people ask when referring to this publication relates to the start of such an enterprise. How do you begin? I asked myself that question at the outset, and I didn't readily find the answer. There was, of course, the basic work, the 2-volume Australian Encyclopaedia, published in 1925-27. But that, clearly enough, couldn't be more than just a basis. It was out of date. Also, it had left a number of gaps. Maybe, too, it leaned rather heavily on New South Wales. I recall that being in Melbourne at the time the work began, that I consulted Sir Russell Grimwade regarding a particular matter, and he said to me, as a dyed-in-the-wool Victorian, "I hope that you're going to cast your eyes fairly round Australia, because the early encyclopaedia was largely a handbook of Sydney." I told Sir Russell that at one stage I'd been described as this Victorian who calls himself a Queenslander and lives in Sydney. So that, I suppose, I could be fairly regarded as being, shall I say, Australia.
He soon found the reputation was an unreliable guide to a person's suitability for encyclopedia, and through a trial and error system gradually built up a staff. Here we can see a list of the staff who worked on the Australian Encyclopaedia. There was a great deal of work to be done across all areas, including editing, managing the contributions and research, index, proofreading, and so on. So a little bit more about Alec Chisholm. Alec Chisholm was a journalist who worked across many major publications in Australia and had actually contributed to the first Australian Encyclopaedia. But during the 1940s, he also worked on the Who's Who in Australia and other major publications that made him a good candidate to work as editor-in-chief. So we'll hear now from Bruce Pratt, who joined Alec Chisholm and was later to go on to be the editor-in-chief of the 1977 edition of the Australian Encyclopaedia. And this is Bruce Pratt just explaining how he ended up working on the Australian Encyclopaedia. He talks here about how after he left the army at the end of World War II, he decided to head towards seeking out employment in the journalism field. From the collection of the National Library of Australia, we hear a brief extract from Bruce talking about how he came to work with Angus and Robertson.
I then did some freelance editing for Angus and Robertson, including books by Hudson Fysh and Dale Collins. Angus and Robertson decided to bring out an Australian Encyclopaedia as a successor work to the 1925 Encyclopaedia. Alec Chisholm was the editor-in-chief. At first I was assistant editor, then later I became general editor under Alec Chisholm. I worked in there full time. Alec Chisholm had, of course, a wonderful knowledge of men, and he was in a very good position to select the right contributor. My job was largely a matter of organising their work and putting it into proper shape for the encyclopaedia. This was in 1950, and I'm still working on the Australian Encyclopaedia, 1972. We worked on the encyclopaedia from 1950 until 1958, when it was published.
Another editor was Henry Mund, an experienced graphic designer and publisher, and he had emigrated from Poland via the UK, and he was very passionate about book publishing and particularly bespoke or elegant book publishing as a key. There were 7 assistant editors, including my mother, Robin Pratt, Bruce's daughter, one of his 3 daughters. Robin joined the encyclopaedia after graduating from University of Sydney. Here is a short extract from Alan Bolton, one of the other editors who had a significant career in Australian publishing. The photographer, Josephine Mayo, who we can see pictured here with Alec Chisholm, looking at one of the maps that she had designed. This is an interesting clip showing the proofreaders, Dorothy Driscoll and Grace George, over on the right. Also, my aunt Megan on the left in that top left photo, and my mother Robin. So Megan must have come in to do some work towards the end, just prior to publication. So assembling the encyclopedia took a huge amount of work. They had to receive contributions, they had to organize them and edit them, make queries about them, organize illustrations and photographs, and liaise with contributors on different issues. And as it expanded, the encyclopedia progressed slowly. There was a mountain of information to assemble and edit. There were around 400 different contributions in different fields of knowledge. Contributions were not always up to standard and had to be reworked. Articles had to be revised to ensure they were up to date. The editors had to work towards achieving a consistent style and tone across the volume. So yes, quite a lot of work indeed. His article about the development of the encyclopedia, Bruce Pratt talks about the huge amount of work involved in obtaining illustrations. And he gives examples of where, in one case, the dress of a First Fleet Marines required a lot of research, and the original plate was engraved. And a historian pointed out that the plate showed the belt of the Sydney Volunteers as tan, whereas in fact it was black. So this unwelcome item of news was responsible for a tedious and costly substitution in the printing blocks. And they had to look at flags, uniforms, coats of arms, had to be handled with the greatest of care. And then just talking about the stamps, which we'll see over the page, was the next hurdle. The cost of photographing in colour 20 stamps behind glass in 20 different cabinets was prohibitive. So another procedure had to be adopted. So by courtesy of the Australian Museum, they were able to take the photos mounted on one sheet. Here are the photos in question. As we'll see below, there were some very well-known contributions from different people from different walks of life. Nancy Keesing, who lived from 1923 to 1993, was born in Sydney and attended school at Skeggs and Frensham. And she went on to a literary career, and she worked full-time as a writer and researcher with the Bulletin magazine. And Nancy was involved in writing the sections about Australian literature. Another very well-known contributor was Frank Hurley, who was an Australian photographer and adventurer, well known for his photographs from the Shackleton's Endurance expedition in Antarctica. He participated in a number of exhibitions to Antarctica, and Frank Hurley contributed a number of photographs to the encyclopedia. So eventually the book was launched. It was completed and printed in its 10 volumes in its characteristic rusty red covers. And a lunch and launch was held by the Book Collectors Society on the 18th of June, 1958. £50 per set was a lot of money in that day and age, equaling about $1,700 in today's money. So if we have a bit of a look at the encyclopedia, the first entry was about Edward Abbott, who was a soldier born in England who served with the New South Wales Corps. And this is an entry about this early soldier who came to Australia and made a life in Australia. There was a very large section on Australian art, including a painting by Russell Drysdale. Some other illustrations featured Lindsay at the top left there, Sydney Ewer Smith on the right. This watercolour painting by Albert Namatjira was also included as one of the illustrations in the book. Literature gives a comprehensive coverage of all the books, and including modern writing, which sometimes gives an unwritten challenge to the idea of cultural cringe and the idea that Australia was developing its own culture. It's a very complex and rich, sort of demonstrates the complex and rich nature of Australia. Diving in Western Australia and Northern Territory. It's interesting to note that at this point in time, Australia has supplied up to 80% of the world's pearl shell, principally to the American market. Today's eyes is to see the entry on whaling and to see some of the numbers of whales killed and captured for use of their oil. the whale preservation movement was really only going to kick off from the 1970s onwards. And thankfully, whaling is now prohibited in Australian waters. Interesting to note in the Australian Encyclopaedia this warning about whaling numbers. Even then, there was concern about the slaughter of them and the endangerment of the species. The wonderful Southern Aurora, travelling from Sydney to Melbourne, the sleeper carriage was launched, and sleeper carriages was launched, I think, in the early 1960s. So this actually might be from a later edition, a revision of which Grolier undertook later on. The encyclopedia provided a history of aircraft in Australia and the growing lines that were travelling internationally, including the Empire Airways, which had existed up until World War II. An example of one of the detailed maps. This one indicating the gauges of the different railways by state. There were a range of articles about flora and fauna. This colour illustration shows flowers which represent the different states, such as the Waratah for New South Wales. We saw other unique trees, such as the baobab tree, which survives in arid regions of the country. Another magnificent illustration of some of the birds of this country. Very fine work that was included in these colour prints for the encyclopedia. Some Australian starfish. An article about camels, just another example of the comprehensive nature of the encyclopedia, talking about how they were introduced in 1839 and became very well used in the Australian desert regions. Canberra, our national city, still looking semi-rural here, and yet to grow post-war to the more major city that it is today. As I mentioned, it was amazing the way that the encyclopedia included entries on towns with over 1,000 population. It would be interesting to see how many of these towns still have 1,000 population, or some may have expanded, but many may have dropped below that point as the whole demographic has changed over the last 70 years. So here's one example of Aberdeen in New South Wales. Another is an entry on the town of Blackheath in the Blue Mountains, although this photo on the left is a contemporary. Then, of course, we have what Alex Chisholm talked about as the more colourful articles, a range of articles on Australian histories, covering a number of major issues, but also different byways into aspects of Australia. Quite a big article on the Snowy River scheme, and we'll include a video just to give a flavour of that feeling of sort of post-war restructuring and infrastructure that came as the country reorganised and reestablished. Atomic energy and weapons gets a look in with quite an optimistic view of the future of nuclear power at that time. And so we get to the final article in the 9 volumes, which was on Zygophyllaceae. I probably haven't pronounced that right, but it is a family of herbs and shrubs with 28 genera that are native to Australia. And so we come to an end of I think it was 4.5 million words that made up the encyclopedia. There was much correspondence to the authors and editors of the encyclopedia, and here Bruce Pratt talks about some of the letters that have been received. So, after 1958, the encyclopedia continued as a growing concern. In 1962, the Grolier Society of Australia purchased the encyclopedia, and we saw this 3rd edition with Bruce being the editor-in-chief in 1977. The encyclopedia was then sold to David Bateman Limited in New Zealand before being sold to the Australian Geographic, and another edition was released in 1988 in hard copy with the editor-in-chief being Richard Appleton. So in conclusion, we can see what a big achievement the encyclopedia was, and it was a lasting reference source that we saw in many libraries across the country for many years. And it's interesting to consider how it really was a point in time. Just a final word from the Editor-in-Chief, Alec Chisholm, about the encyclopedia.
Wrote to me saying that in his judgment the encyclopedia should be banned, not on the ordinary basis that banning is imposed, but because he found it so readable that it was occupying too much of his time. He made a practice of taking it down after dinner to look at one individual item, and by the time he'd looked at this individual item, which might have been in B, he found himself up in the Gulf of Carpentaria and the whole of his night gone.
Achievement alongside other national sort of endeavours that were taking place at that time. Some references just to have a look at, interested in looking at them further. Here are some more, including video interviews that I included through often through the Hazel de Burgh collection of the National Library. Thanks for listening in. Bye for now.